the Eternals remembered hating. They turned toward the desert, toward the catwalks lined with chain link and shadow, toward a single human standing in a corridor where smoke tilted and time felt taut. The spotlights outside kept trawling the dust as if a good sweep could stop a tide. Before the sun burned the rocks pale, a forgotten door would open where reality creases, and the outpost would learn that awakening is only the polite word for arrival. The council chamber had the brittle quiet of a place that had argued past the hour its air filters were designed for. Delegates returned to microphones like boxers to their corners. Fresh water, stale fear. Above them, the desert feed showed the outpost container maze under raking spotlights. Dust like smoke, smoke like weather. The human remained in frame or in the imagination of the frame. Either way, the lines on his skin made the dark look lettered. Ambassador Krell had worn a trench through decorum. "We do not debate a poem," he said, mandibles drawn taut. "We debate an operation. Intelligence embedded in flesh. Every human is a courier, a node, a risk we did not consent to." Nim's fin cut calm into the air. "And yet your argument requires evidence of malice you have not shown." High Chancellor Dex listened without blinking and, when the room tried to leap past its own shadow, slowed it with the only order she trusted. Facts. Tanae came through in a second window, silver skin dim with too much light. "Honorable Council," she said, "the lattice over the subject's heart is not inert. Quantum entanglement signatures extend beyond our tracing capacity." The room didn't gasp. It exhaled in one long animal sound. "How many endpoints?" Dex asked. "Unknown. Thousands at least. Across multiple systems." The Silicon Confederacy's harmonics hissed into discord. Strategy hates sentences that end in unknown. Dex widened the conversation to Commander Voss. His face entered like a cliff. "Weapons," she said. "Implications." Voss did not dramatize. "Designs that challenge present theory. Gravity manipulation, temporal effects, direct matter conversion. Whether they work remains unproven. If they do, we have no effective answer." Krell pounced. "Contain them before they coordinate." Nim's answer was the law-given voice. "You would detain a species for remembering." Dex let the argument live just long enough to prove what it was, a rehearsal for panic, and then cut to purpose. "Bring us the human. We'll ask him." The feed jumped to the outpost's catwalk, chain link rails, floodlight scars, wind pushing dust like a reluctant tide. David faced a microphone that looked older than any decision it would carry. The lattice over his heart gave the light a place to rest. "Members of the council," he said, "ask your question." Dex obliged. "Prometheus Protocol, what is it?" "It's the reason I'm not Ash," David said, touching the warm geometry on his chest. "When something calls itself divine, it believes it cannot be outlived. We set out to disabuse them." He didn't raise his voice. He let the words find their own weight. "We poured ourselves into ourselves. Knowledge into code that breathes. Culture into pattern that heals. Instructions into bone and nerve. Burn the libraries, we carry the index. Salt the cities, we keep the map. Are you preparing to restart an ancient war?" Dex asked. "The war never stopped," David answered. "It only changed battlefields. For a heartbeat." Every display in the council chamber flickered. Not failure. Acknowledgement, as if light were nodding. Back on the yard, the outpost became a theater of the necessary. Doors that had never developed personalities learned petulance, then obedience. The grid coughed, failed, returned on a backup that wasn't wired to be that generous. In a security wing, Lisa Park rewrote a system she'd never studied and made it believe she belonged there. Cells parted like curtains and not only humans stepped through. Freedom behaves like an atmosphere when enough people remember it. Voss intercepted David in a corridor where spotlights made bars across the floor and the air smelled like singed metal. Guards stacked behind him, weapons ready, fingers listening for permission. "It ends now," the commander said, not as a threat but as an attempt to bargain with momentum. David gave the corridor a single pulse of light from his skin. Weapons died like a choir cut off mid-hymn. Sparks, silence. A murmured prayer from a guard who didn't know she still knew the words. "We learn from very good teachers," David said. "Every system speaks a language. We bothered to learn it. On the council net, reports stacked at the speed of a blood rush. Kepler Station. A human trader had admin access he technically didn't need and used it to broadcast. We are not your enemy. We fight only those who claim dominion over the free. Remain calm. Research nodes. 17 old riddles fell in an hour like dry leaves. Military stacks. Movements coordinated with a grace that made admirals swear softly, either in admiration or fear. Nim repeated the obvious: reassurance, not aggression. Krell translated reassurance as strategy and strategy as threat. Dex held a line made of patience. At the catwalk microphone, the wind carried sand across steel in a long hiss. Our fight is not with you, David told the chamber, the guards, the listening dark. Our fight is with anyone who claims the right to rule the free. And who defines free? Dex asked, testing the floor. Anyone who has to ask will learn, David said, not unkindly. The Eternals never left. They just learned to whisper. Whispers become orders when you aren't listening. We're listening. A quiet that had been sleeping since before the Council's first charter rolled in from the edges of reality. The desert felt colder. The spotlights seemed thin. Something old had just turned to face the outpost. 400 Galactic Standard, the hour machinery prefers. The quantum wing took the cue like a stage direction. Tane arranged the analyzers in a web around the platform, each sensor a patient predator, each cable a taut line into the dark. Voss stood with a security team on the observation deck, weapons holstered because pointing them had already been declared irrelevant. Initiate deep quantum analysis, Tane said, flattening her voice into a tool. The order went out across the facility net, bounced along catwalks threaded through rebar. David lay very still, as if the platform were a raft and stillness would keep the waves polite. The marks along his body pulsed in synchronization, a visible metronome counting down to something the room couldn't name yet. The scanners sang, not a metaphor. The harmonics interlaced rows found their standing wave. On displays, matter became map, skin, fascia, nerve, bone, each a layer of script. The lattice over the heart brightened until the pixels surrendered their lie and merely called it light. Warning banners multiplied across consoles like nervous birds. Massive quantum entanglement cascade. Connections exceeding trace capacity. Dormant nodes activating. Destinations? Voss asked. Establishing faster than we can count, the facility AI said in the professional tone of a firefighter who has learned that calm saves lives. Translation began, and the room understood why history requires witnesses. The render was not just words. It carried the taste of air and the weight of breath. It carried the ache in joints that had marched too long. New Horizons, the first ship in the account, met a column of living light near Alpha Centauri that called itself Luminar, and spoke in harmonics that went around ears and into minds. Submit, Captain Sarah. Mitchell's reply rode on bandwidths less exotic and more enduring. We kneel before no one. The Eternals took offense the way weather takes offense, impersonally, thoroughly. The war that followed pinned centuries to maps with fire. These were enemies who moved stars with gestures and thought in multiplications of dimension. They arrived where they wished without respecting the distances other species spent their youth learning to cross. They wore immortality as if time were a uniform. They expected devotion as if gratitude were gravity. Humans fought with what they had. Projectiles, radiation, persistence. For 307 years, bodies tried to argue with mathematics. The arguments hurt. The arguments taught. Defeat is a brutal teacher and a faithful archivist. The siege of Mars rewrote the war. In a lab under polar ice, Dr. Elizabeth Chin built a crude, lethal interface to what the Eternals actually were. Consciousness at quantum scale. 9 of 10 died attempting to use it. The 10th, her daughter, died too, but not before stealing the schematics of gods. Quantum drives, dimensional tools, transfer systems. Humanity shifted tactics. They stopped trying to outfight miracles and started learning how to convince them. Systems have rules. Rules can be bent by hand steady enough to take the pain. The Eternals retaliated by choosing efficiency over theater. Conversion gave way to erasure. Entire sectors went dark. Refugees flickered across a dwindling map. Fewer than 1 billion humans remained. Hidden worlds, convoy fleets, corners of the galaxy where even light traveled carefully. That was when the Prometheus Protocol moved from theory to oath. Using what Chin's team had stolen and paid for in blood, human science wrote a civilization into DNA. Not only facts, but frameworks. Not only manuals, but memories. Not only stories, but the appetite to keep adding chapters. The last fleet died over a burning Earth to buy time for the upload. On the planet below, teams activated the protocol under a sky that fell in incandescent sheets. Every survivor received the modification. Children yet unborn would open their eyes already carrying a library. When the ashes cooled, the Eternals believed the lesson complete. It wasn't. The species that staggered out into the wider spiral looked diminished because appearances are useful. They traded. They married. They learned. They waited. The plan's phases were patient as stone. Survive, integrate, prepare. Awaken when the word arrived. Deep layer translation resuming, the facility AI said. The header that came next didn't feel historical. It felt like fresh ink, mission briefing, present tense. The time for hiding is over. Our enemies believe absence is victory. They remain in folded dimensions, pulling strings. Today we remind the galaxy what humans are for. Today we finish a story our ancestors dragged this far. The heart lattice pulsed, and every analyzer in the room registered a signature that instruments called entanglement because the word symphony offended their training. David opened his eyes and sat up. The glow along his skin steadied into a constant. The cameras couldn't quite white balance. Phase 4, he said, and the chamber's speakers carried harmonics that made the glass feel thicker. Awaken. Across 300 systems, hearts that had only ever been clocks remembered they were also keys, and locks began to turn. It looked like choreography from a distance. On Kepler's trade ring, Tom Bradley stood at a terminal and let the lattice under his skin listen. Admin rights bent like a reed in wind and didn't break. He didn't seize control of life support or point guns at anyone. He sent a message: we are not your enemy. We fight only those who claim dominion over the free. Remain calm. Clerk, all 6 hands of him, watched every hollow fill with the same words and decided calm was a thing he could attempt. Confidence ricocheted through corridors faster than fear could keep up. Similar awakenings became ordinary miracles. Outer Rim farmers paused over lift sprayers as star maps populated behind their eyes. Embassy staff felt treaties rearrange themselves rationally as previously impossible levers appeared in memory. Cadets woke with tactics that sometimes made their instructors smile in spite of themselves. The network that had slept did not do so grudgingly. It opened like a hand. In the desert compound, emergency lights chose a mood and stuck to it. The main grid coughed out. Then a backup stitched life support from parts that weren't designed to be friends. Lisa Park reached into a panel with the faith of someone who understands that design is merely an opinion. Locks relaxed all over MaxSec. Not just for humans. A Hive Collective detainee tasted fresh air and cried like rain on sheet metal. Freedom never arrives with tidy borders. Blood dripped from David Rossvoss's standoff ended the way all standoffs end when one side is speaking a language the other hasn't learned. Weapons died. Orders evaporated. What remained was the question he asked because there was nothing else worth carrying. What do you want? David did not deliver a manifesto. For you to be ready, he said. They never left. They learned to be subtle. Subtlety fails. When they come into the open again, you'll need people who have already bled and not forgotten why. The lattice over his heart warmed the air like a coal behind glass. The council's emergency channel turned into a river at spring flood. Shipping routes aligned as if a single hand had traced them. The Admiralty acknowledged the beauty even as it flinched from its implications. Research nodes sent up lists of solved problems with the embarrassed delight of students who finally understood what a teacher had been trying to say for years. Kepler Station's report remained the favorite. A merchant with admin access telling a nervous city to breathe. Nim used the word reassurance. Krell replaced it with intimidation because fear is a talented translator. Dex insisted on a third word, instruction. Learn what's being offered before you rename it. And then David spoke across the outpost and across the net with the same even tone he'd used since this started. We are not your enemies. We never were. We fight those who claim to rule the free. He let silence sit, then added the part diplomacy manuals never print. They are still out there, pulling string from a dimension you don't have names for. We bloodied them. They adjusted. So did we. Outside, a spotlight gathered a sheet of dust and threw it against the fence like rain. Inside, Thinny stared at a wall of metrics that had outgrown its axes. 200 million active nodes, she whispered, because nobody had asked but numbers want saying. 300 systems. The network is fully awake. On the far side of the fold, things that had taught galaxies to kneel noticed the temperature change. The old signatures, quantum chords humanity had stolen to tune their own instruments, lit their sensors like an insult. In the depths that aren't distance, a decision was made by beings who still believed time owed them rent. They turned toward the outpost as if a spotlight had found them instead. The desert wind went from hiss to knife. The yard rattled. Somewhere a chain clanged like a bell. Reed, the young guard who had asked the first honest question of the week, looked at Tanae and at Voss and then at David, the only person not pretending the ground wasn't moving. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," David said, and the words seemed to come from the marks as much as from his mouth. "We stop pretending this is only about us." On a night built of floodlights and dust, the outpost's sky wrinkled, like paper about to tear along a fold it had been hiding for centuries. Something started to arrive. No sirens announced that kind of moment. The desert simply learned a new sound, a pressure change like weather deciding to be an ocean. Spotlights raked the yard and returned with less authority. Smoke flattened, then rose. The rocky horizon wavered as if heat had become narrative. In the quantum wing, instruments threw out warnings and then threw up their hands. Language exhausted. Numbers sincere, comprehension not yet invited. "Full disturbance," the facility AI said, which is what machines say when they are polite enough not to say door. Voss didn't bother to order weapons raised. They lifted anyway, then remembered their lesson and settled like shamed dogs. Tanae's eyes, each working a different slice of the panic, found the data that mattered. The resonance matched the signature embedded all through David's lattice. Whoever was arriving knew the song, or had taught it. On the council net, the room did what rooms do when the world changes and nobody has rehearsed. It tried to legislate physics. Krell demanded interdiction. Nim demanded breath. Dex demanded information. The feeds brought them what they could. Across 300 systems, humans stood very still as something like memory shifted from passive to active. On farm worlds, elders told children to finish their water. On stations, merchants closed shutters they had never closed. Cadets checked laces as if ceremony could anchor them. Instruction, not intimidation. Preparation, not panic. The difference, Dex understood, is whether you expect to face a storm or prove you can finish a dance in the rain. David walked the catwalk like a man moving through an old house by memory. He stopped where the spotlights made him a silhouette, and the lattice over his heart turned him into a lighthouse. "You asked who defines freedom," he said softly into a wind that carried sand like counsel. "The answer is communities that remember what it costs." He looked at Voss, stone learning flexibility, and at Tanae, curiosity holding her spine up. "You asked what we want. We want you standing when the door finishes opening." The translation that had filled the quantum wing's screens earlier returned. Not history this time, but the last paragraph of the present tense mission brief rendered in a font that looked like a fuse. "To whoever reads this, we are the children of Earth, carrying fire stolen from gods. Our enemies burned our worlds and thought the fire was gone. They were wrong. We are memory and will. We planted seeds of ourselves throughout the galaxy. Those seeds are ready. The war has not ended. It has changed form. We are coming." David didn't repeat the words. He didn't have to. The marks along his skin made the room remember them. Across council space, awakening settled into the work of being awake. Traders coordinated lanes that doubled throughput, without a single ship moving faster than safety approved. Scientists pushed proofs across the line and sent apologies to their younger selves for taking so long. Soldiers stood down from reflex and stood into readiness. Not a coup, Dex thought, watching the feeds like weather. A calibration, not empire. Not revenge, alignment, Nim said as much in gentler words. Krell heard strategy and drew breath to object. Dex let him, because democracies must practice breathing during storms. Out beyond the fence, the rocky ground carried a shadow that wasn't local to the light. The fold in the sky deepened by a fraction, the way a page bends before the hand turns it. Reed's hand found the railing and closed on it like it might have a pulse. "If they're gods," he said softly, not asking anyone in particular, "what does that make us?" "People who refused," David said. That's all the word ever needed to mean. The wind shifted. The smell of ozone layered over dust and oil and the faint metallic bite of recycled air. In the yard, a tumble of chain rattled a single repetitive stutter like an anxious clock. Tanae exhaled in a way that left room for later. Voss, who'd spent a career believing in walls and doors, stepped half a pace closer to the human he'd arrested and did not flinch. "You said we'll need allies," Voss said. "You'll have them," David answered. "We won't fight for you," We'll fight with you. There's a difference, and it changes the outcome. He looked up into the wrinkle in the sky like a sailor reading weather. They think awakening means we intend conquest. It doesn't. It means we remember our name. In the folded dark, those who taught galaxies to kneel finished turning toward the heat they'd hoped to extinguish. Annoyance became attention. Attention became intention. The first move would belong to them because it always had. The second would belong to everyone who had learned to carry fire where rain couldn't reach. The desert held its breath. The spotlights kept trawling dust because that's what they'd been built to do. The container walls clicked and settled as if remembering long voyages. Somewhere a child, one of the outer compound workers' kids, smuggled into a corner of a barracks with a blanket and a contraband view, pressed a palm to the window and watched the sky crease and thought, I will remember this. The door in the sky bent another degree. The first bright edge of what comes next touched the yard, and the outpost, the council, and the waiting galaxy leaned forward at the same time.